Socialists have been divided over many issues, and one of the main issues they have been divided over is the roads to socialism, or the means by which socialist society can be achieved. In this video, we're going to look at one of these roads to socialism, the revolutionary road, and hopefully we're going to know and describe what the revolutionary road was, to understand the rationale behind the revolutionary road, and also to evaluate the reasons for its lack of success. So this first alternative road to socialism, or the initial road to socialism, was that of a revolution. First two questions are really, why was a revolution inevitable, and then why was a revolution necessary? And in a previous video where we looked at the origins of Marxism and Marx's assertion that a proletarian revolution was inevitable and would overthrow the capitalist state. So the first question we look at then is, why was this revolution inevitable? The first reason you could say is the arrogance of Marx and Engels, who saw themselves as scientists, and in particular Marx saw his work as a scientific explanation with predictable outcomes. Through his study of previous societies, he had come to the conclusion that class struggle was the key to understanding historical development, and just as previous societies had succumbed to revolutions, so the capitalist society would succumb to it as well. It was inevitable because it was a scientific explanation. It was bound to happen. And in the phrase from Communist Manifesto, the history of all previous societies has been the history of class struggles, and so the history of capitalist society will be the history of class struggle leading to an inevitable revolution. Second reason why a revolution was inevitable, again, like all previous societies, the ruling class in each previous society had also produced their own antithesis, the reason for their downfall. And capitalist society had produced the ruling class of the bourgeoisie, and equally that then had produced their own antithesis in the form of the proletariat. And from the Communist Manifesto again, what the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all are its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. So the proletariat would inevitably be the gravediggers of capitalism and lead to the downfall of the capitalist system. Another reason why revolution was inevitable was because of the internal contradictions within capitalism. It was essentially a system of naked exploitation. It depended on profit, and profit depended on the proletariat being exploited through, as we've seen previously, the concept of surplus value. And this exploitation was something that simply could not continue, as conditions would worsen, as the proletariat were squeezed even further, and that would also contribute to this inevitable revolution. The proletariat themselves, and Marx's concept of alienation, had no stake in capitalist society. They were alienated from the entire system. They were alienated from the products they were producing. They were alienated from their fellow workers. They were alienated from the process. They were subject to supervision, and also they were alienated from themselves, and their labour was simply a commodity to be bought and sold. And a final reason was Marx's theory that capitalism was subject to a recurrent crisis of boom and busts due to overproduction. And as these crises got longer and deeper, the conditions of the proletariat would deteriorate even further, until eventually they would spontaneously achieve class consciousness and rise up in a proletarian revolution and overthrow the system. And Marx saw revolutions are a good thing. They were the motors of history. So in summary then, why was the revolution inevitable? First reason, Marx's scientific analysis of historical development, historical materialism, suggested that it was inevitable based on his study of previous societies. Capitalism, like all previous societies, contained its own antithesis to the ruling class, the seeds of its own destruction, in this case, the proletariat. The proletariat themselves were alienated by the capitalist system. They had no stake in the system, which was simply one of naked exploitation. Due to overproduction, capitalism itself was subject to a recurring cycle of boom and bust, with ever-deepening recessions lead to ever-worsening conditions from the proletariat. And eventually, when conditions were ripe, the proletariat would emerge from false consciousness, achieve class consciousness, and spontaneously rise up and overthrow the system. The second question then will be why a revolution was necessary, which is a related but slightly different question. Well, a revolution was necessary because when Marx was writing, the working classes, the proletariat, did not have the vote. They had no avenue of political representation, so they had no other way to achieve their aims. Working class institutions, which could have campaigned and fought to improve working class conditions, were, to say the least, underdeveloped. For example, trade unions were illegal. In any case, reform of the capitalist system, Marx would argue, was simply not possible through normal political channels, because the entire superstructure, the bourgeois state, was fundamentally biased in favour of the ruling class. And a final, broader reason why revolution was necessary was a revolution would provide the cathartic root and branch removal of the rotten system and would lead to a qualitative as well as a quantitative change in society. As we've seen in a previous video, this inevitable revolution would occur spontaneously, but Marx believed it would only occur in mature capitalist economies such as Germany and Great Britain. He thought were the most likely places when conditions were ripe. So, as we know, this didn't happen. The question is, what happened Marx's inevitable revolution? Well, you could say that capitalism fought back, and it proved much more enduring than Marx had anticipated. Starting from mid-Victorian times, some of the worst excesses of unrestrained or unregulated capitalism began to be addressed through a series of legislation. Also, the vote began to be extended to working classes, and also trade unions and other working class institutions began to develop. In that sense, you could say the working class, the proletariat, began to be given a stake in capitalist society. By the late 19th century, clearly there had been no revolution, and this led to Lenin arguing that workers would not spontaneously develop revolutionary class consciousness. He was a strong follower of Marx, but began to disagree with Marx and this idea that you would have a spontaneous revolution. Rather, influenced and deluded by the so-called reforms of the capitalist system, workers had only achieved what he very derisively called trade union consciousness. They were only concerned with wages and conditions, bourgeois ideas and beliefs. Therefore, what Lenin argued was needed was a revolutionary party, a party that would lead the working class out of this false consciousness, and they would act as the vanguard of the proletariat. This revolutionary party would be staffed by professional revolutionaries who had a full-time job, and they would educate and organize the proletariat and lead them into this class revolution. As we've seen, in mature capitalist economies, the revolution didn't occur. And where it did occur, unsurprisingly, was in the very backward or feudal society almost of Russia. The Bolsheviks, the Communist Party, was Lenin's version of the vanguard party, and they seized their opportunity in 1917 to develop the revolution in Russia and overthrow the Tsarist regime, often in the face of arguments from other Marxists who said you couldn't force the revolution, you could only wait for it to happen in mature capitalist economies. But Lenin and the Bolsheviks were opportunistic enough to take their opportunities. However, there were consequences for the revolution in Russia. Again, clearly Russia was not a mature capitalist economy, so therefore Lenin's successor, Stalin, adopts what's called state socialism. The state leads the abolition of private property with the collectivization of agriculture and rapid industrialization. The capitalist market was replaced, but it was replaced by centralized state planning. There's a ruthless suppression of all political opposition, and it turns into a totalitarian dictatorship. So this Stalinist version of socialism or state socialism becomes the template or the norm of what people refer to as communism, but it's a particular version of socialism as it developed in Russia after the revolution. Fast forward a number of years, and a strand called neo-Marxism begins to develop, which is a reappraisal of classical Marxism in view of the failure to capitalism to collapse, certainly outside the Soviet Union, and also a disillusionment and a rejection of orthodox or Stalinist communism, which was seen as inefficient, totalitarian. They felt it was a corruption of socialism, and all it had done was create a new elite or a new ruling class. Neo-Marxism involved this reappraisal of Marx ideas. It saw the removal of the privileged status of the working class and acceptance that the working class were not going to rise up in revolt and overthrow the capitalist system. It downgraded Marx's emphasis on the economic base, and also it rejected the determinism or inevitability of Marx. Gramsci in particular is associated with the neo-Marxist thinking. He argued that the class system was maintained not by just economic and social power, but also what he described as bourgeois hegemony. This idea of bourgeois hegemony, that the power of the ruling class was maintained by much more subtle means than rather naked exploitation and power, which was maintained by the spread of bourgeois values and beliefs via civil society, the media, churches, trade unions, etc. In effect, he was saying it was about Marx's old superstructure, which Marx had been so dismissive of. Gramsci now says this as one of the dominant forces in maintaining the capitalist structure. And neo-Marxists look to tackle this bourgeois hegemony and counter it with what they described as a proletarian hegemony. Although during the 20th century, China and some developing world states did experience a Soviet-type revolution, for example, Cuba and Cambodia, this revolutionary road, and again you can argue the neo-Marxists like Gramsci were revolutionary, but for them it was more the line from the Beatles song, a revolution in the head. But the revolutionary road, in terms of achieving socialism, was generally unloved and politically bankrupt with the fall of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, which appeared to confirm the failings of state socialism and revolutionary means. So the first road to socialism, that of revolution, really comes to a dead end in the late 1980s.